All right, let's dive into the fascinating world of Patrick Radden Keefe's Say Nothing. This isn't your typical history book packed with just dates and events. It's more like peeling back the layers of a real-life mystery set against one of the most turbulent times in modern history, the Troubles in Northern Ireland. The book kicks off with a gripping introduction set in 2013 at the Burns Library in Boston. Sounds random, right? But here's the twist. This library holds secret tapes from former IRA members, people who lived through and sometimes led the violence of the Troubles. And get this, two detectives from Belfast fly to Boston to retrieve these tapes as part of a murder investigation. The secrecy, the high stakes, it's like the opening scene of a thriller. So, what's this book really about? It's about memory, silence, and the cost of loyalty. The story revolves around Jean McConville, a widowed mother of 10 who was abducted and murdered in 1972 by the IRA. Her disappearance became one of the most haunting symbols of the violence that engulfed Northern Ireland for decades. But it's also about the people behind the cause, like Dolores Price, a charismatic yet deeply conflicted IRA member whose story is just as central. Keefe uses Jean's case as a lens to explore the Troubles, a period spanning the late 1960s to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. Marked by brutal conflict between Catholic nationalists who wanted a united Ireland and Protestant Unionists loyal to Britain. It's about bombings, betrayals, hunger strikes, and how these events tore families and communities apart. But it also asks a deeper question. How do people deal with the aftermath of such violence? Do you forget, forgive, or hold on to the pain? Now, who's this book for? It's for anyone who loves a good true crime story, but also for people curious about the human side of history. It's written like a detective novel, serious, yes, but also dramatic and easy to follow. You don't have to be a historian to get hooked. What's amazing is how Keefe balances it all. The big political picture with intimate, deeply personal stories. It's heartbreaking, suspenseful, and at times, even shocking. He really makes you think about how silence and memory can shape history, not just the events themselves, but how they're remembered and retold. So, if you're ready for a story that's part mystery, part history, and full-on human drama, Say Nothing is the book for you. Let me take you back to Belfast in the 1970s, where everything was on edge, families torn apart, communities divided, and violence lurking around every corner. Part 1 of Say Nothing plunges us straight into this chaos, and trust me, it's a ride filled with heartbreak, tension, and some truly mind-blowing stories. It all begins with an ordinary December evening in 1972 that turns into a nightmare. Jean McConville, a mother of 10, hears a knock on her door. Her life changes forever when masked figures storm in, pull her away from her terrified children, and vanish into the night. Imagine the fear, her kids crying and screaming, the youngest barely understanding what's happening. She's told she'll be back in a few hours, but she never returns. This moment is where we meet the McConville family, and it sets the tone for the book. A story of love, loss, and the terrible price of silence. Now, let's zoom out and meet the Price sisters, Dolores and Marion, who are central to this story. Raised in a fiercely Republican family, they grew up listening to their father's thrilling tales of IRA raids and escapes. These stories weren't just bedtime entertainment, they were an indoctrination. By their teens, these sisters weren't just rebelling against the British, they were challenging their own family's ideas, debating strategies for a united Ireland over dinner. Dolores, with her sharp wit and striking presence, emerges as a fiery, headstrong figure. But what's fascinating is how she starts questioning even the IRA's effectiveness. She's not just a soldier in the making, she's also a thinker, someone deeply conflicted about the violence she's about to embrace. And speaking of violence, let's talk about Belfast during the Troubles. Imagine living in a maze of grim public housing where fear seeps into every corner. The McConville family moves into Divis Flats, this towering, dystopian complex that was supposed to be a modern housing marvel but quickly turned into a slum. Here, danger wasn't just a possibility, it was a constant companion. Soldiers patrolled the streets, and gunfire became the soundtrack of daily life. For the McConville kids, life was about survival, huddling on the floor during gun battles, trying to make sense of a world that felt like it was falling apart. But it's not just about the McConville family. Keefe introduces us to the IRA, an underground army that was, at this point, struggling to find its footing. What's wild is how disorganized and poorly armed they were in the beginning. Can you believe they actually sold off some of their weapons to the Free Wales army before the violence erupted? That's how unprepared they were. But everything changed with leaders like Billy McKee, a hardliner who took control and reignited the movement. He wasn't just about the cause. He was about taking action violently, if necessary. One of the most chilling parts of Part 1 is learning how the IRA operated in places like Divis Flats. There's this almost cinematic description of the chain, a system where guns would be passed from one flat to another through back windows whenever the British Army came knocking. It's like something out of a spy thriller, but it was real life for these people. And then there's the culture of silence, the understanding that you never talked, no matter what. Breaking that code could mean your life. Dolores Price enters the scene as a key player in this new, aggressive IRA. She's young, ambitious, and willing to risk everything for the cause. But what makes her story so compelling is her humanity. Keefe doesn't paint her as a one-dimensional figure. You see her struggles, her doubts, and the toll this life takes on her. And her involvement in missions like planting bombs in England sets the stage for some of the most dramatic moments in later chapters. But let's not forget about Jean McConville and her family. The shadow of her abduction hangs over everything. The IRA accuses her of being an informant, but her children insist she was just a mother trying to get by. This question, was she guilty or just a victim of paranoia, becomes one of the book's central mysteries. And as we'll see, the truth is murky, wrapped up in layers of fear and secrecy. Keefe also gives us a sense of how everyday people got caught in the crossfire. There's this heart-wrenching scene where Jean's young son watches her being dragged away and realizes, with horror, that some of the people taking her are neighbors, people they knew. Imagine that betrayal. Imagine growing up with that kind of trauma. The McConville children are left to fend for themselves in a society that seems to have forgotten them. Their story is as much about survival as it is about loss. And let's not overlook the British side of things. The soldiers who arrived in Belfast were often young and clueless about the complexities of the conflict. Initially welcomed by Catholics, they quickly became another oppressive force. Divis Flats even had a British Army observation post at the top, turning the complex into a symbol of surveillance and control. The tension between the soldiers and the local population added another layer to this already volatile situation. By the end of Part 1, you're left with this overwhelming sense of a community trapped in a cycle of violence and mistrust. Jean McConville's disappearance, the Price sisters' radicalization, the IRA's resurgence, all of these threads weave together into a tapestry of heartbreak and resilience. And the big question looms. In a conflict where everyone believes they're on the right side, how do you determine who's truly innocent? Part 1 sets the stage beautifully for what's to come. It's a tale of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, and Keefe's storytelling makes you feel every ounce of their fear, hope, and despair. If you thought history was just a collection of dates and facts, this book will change your mind. It's history with a heartbeat. Part 2 of Say Nothing shifts into high gear. If Part 1 was setting the stage, this is where the tension explodes. It's titled Human Sacrifice, and trust me, that title isn't an exaggeration. This part of the book dives deep into the sacrifices, voluntary and forced, that define the Troubles, weaving stories of bravery, brutality, and betrayal. We start with the IRA turning up the heat. Their operations get bolder, and their targets even more ambitious. One of their most audacious plans unfolds in England, where they plant bombs in the heart of London. This wasn't just about causing destruction. It was a message, loud and clear, that the conflict in Northern Ireland could no longer be contained to its borders. What makes this chapter gripping isn't just the scale of the violence, but the meticulous planning behind it. We're talking about young people, many barely out of their teens, carrying out missions with military precision. And yet, the human element is always there, moments of fear, doubt, and second-guessing. It's a stark reminder that behind every act of terror is a person, wrestling with their own conscience. Then comes the story of the Belfast 10, a group of IRA members captured and put on trial. This chapter feels like a courtroom drama, but with the stakes cranked up to 11. The trial becomes a stage not just for legal arguments, but for the IRA to make their case to the world. Dolores and Marion Price, the charismatic sisters we met earlier, are at the center of this storm. Their defiance in the courtroom is legendary. They refuse to recognize the court's authority, turning their trial into a political statement. But the real shocker comes when they're sentenced to prison and launch a hunger strike. Hunger strikes are a recurring theme in this book, and this one is particularly gut-wrenching. The Price sisters endure unimaginable suffering, refusing food for months in protest of their imprisonment and treatment. The toll on their bodies and minds is horrific, and yet they never waver. It's both inspiring and deeply unsettling. As the story unfolds, we get a closer look at the IRA's inner workings. One of the most fascinating aspects is their use of informants or touts. These were people within their ranks or even their families who secretly fed information to the British. The paranoia this creates is palpable. Imagine living in a world where you can't trust your closest allies, where every conversation could be a trap. The IRA's response to suspected informants is brutal. People disappear overnight, never to be seen again. It's chilling, especially when you realize that many of these so-called informants were innocent, caught up in a web of suspicion and fear. One of the standout stories in Part 2 is about the ultimate weapon hunger strikes. This wasn't just a tactic, it was a statement, a way for the IRA to claim moral high ground. The most famous hunger strike, of course, is Bobby Sands and the 1981 protest that shook the world. But before that, we see the seeds of this strategy being planted. Dolores Price and her fellow prisoners demand to be treated as political prisoners, not criminals, and when their demands are ignored, they go on strike. It's a battle of wills, with their own bodies as the battleground. The descriptions of their suffering are harrowing. You can almost feel their pain, their desperation, and their determination. And what's even more striking is the psychological toll, how hunger doesn't just weaken the body, but also messes with the mind. But it's not all about the IRA. The British government plays a massive role in this story, and their tactics are just as ruthless. There's a particularly jaw-dropping moment when we learn about the lengths they went to infiltrate the Republican movement. Undercover agents, wiretaps, even blackmail. It's a spy thriller come to life. The British weren't just fighting a physical war, they were waging a psychological one. They knew that sowing distrust within the IRA could be just as effective as any military operation. One of the more surprising moments in this section comes from Field Day, which takes us into the cultural side of the conflict. Amid all the violence, there's this push to reclaim Irish identity through art, literature, and theater. It's a fascinating contrast, the brutality of war alongside the beauty of creativity. And it's not just about preserving culture, it's about using it as a weapon. Plays and poems become tools of resistance, reminding people of who they are and what they're fighting for. As we move deeper into Part 2, the focus shifts to the impact of all this violence on the people involved. The psychological scars run deep. Many IRA members live with constant fear, not just of being caught by the British, but of being betrayed by their own. The weight of their actions takes a toll, too. Bombings and assassinations aren't easy to carry on your conscience, no matter how justified they might seem in the moment. There's a haunting scene where one IRA member reflects on the lives he's taken, questioning whether the cause was worth it. It's moments like these that make you pause and think about the true cost of war, not just in lives lost but in humanity sacrificed. And then there's the story of Dolores Price herself. If you thought she was compelling in Part 1, Part 2 takes her story to another level. Her journey from idealistic young rebel to hardened operative is both fascinating and tragic. She becomes deeply involved in the IRA's operations, including some of its most infamous missions. But as the years go on, you see the cracks start to form. The hunger strike, the violence, the betrayals, it all takes a toll. By the end of this section, Dolores is a shadow of her former self, struggling to reconcile her ideals with the reality of what she's done. What makes Part 2 so powerful is how it humanizes everyone involved. Yes, the IRA committed horrific acts of violence, but Keefe never lets you forget that these were real people, with hopes, fears, and doubts. The same goes for the British soldiers and undercover agents. This isn't a story of good versus evil. It's a story of people caught in an impossible situation, trying to make sense of a world that often doesn't make sense. By the end of Part 2, you're left with a sense of just how messy and complicated the troubles were. There are no easy answers, no clear heroes or villains. It's a story of sacrifice, some noble, some tragic, all of it deeply human. And the most haunting part? The realization that many of these sacrifices were made in vain, leaving behind nothing but more pain and more questions. Stay tuned, because part 3 is where all the threads start to come together. Secrets will be revealed, and the reckoning we've been building toward is finally on the horizon. You won't want to miss it. Part 3 of Say Nothing is where the story reaches its climax. It's called a reckoning, and trust me, that's exactly what it is, a culmination of decades of secrets, betrayals, and moral dilemmas. This is where all the threads that Patrick Radden Keefe has been weaving finally come together. If the first 2 parts were about setting up the conflict and the sacrifices people made, this section is about the consequences. It's raw, it's shocking, and it's impossible to put down. The opening chapters of Part 3 pull us back into the world of Jean McConville's disappearance. By now, we've seen the event from multiple perspectives, but here, Keefe digs even deeper. What happened to Jean is one of the most haunting mysteries of the Troubles. Imagine the weight of that 10 children left behind, wondering what had happened to their mother, while the community around them chose to stay silent. And the thing is, it wasn't just silence born out of fear. There were whispers, suspicions, even accusations. People knew. The IRA knew. And as we'll come to learn, some of the people closest to the McConville family had played a role in her fate. One of the standout moments in this section is the revelation of the Boston tapes. Now, if you thought this was just going to be a straightforward story about the Troubles, this part will blow your mind. Decades after the violence had subsided, Boston College undertook a secretive project to record the oral histories of IRA members and Loyalist paramilitaries. It was meant to be a kind of truth and reconciliation effort, a way for these fighters to tell their stories without fear of prosecution. But here's the catch. These tapes contain confessions, names, details of operations, and most importantly, the truth about Jean McConville. You can imagine what happened next. The tapes, which were supposed to stay locked away until after the participants' deaths, became evidence in an international murder investigation. The fallout from this is just wild arrests, lawsuits, political firestorms. It's the kind of thing that would make an incredible movie. And then there's Dolores Price. Her story takes center stage again in Part 3, and it's devastating to watch. By this point, Dolores is a woman unraveling. She's haunted by the things she's done, the people she's hurt, and the ideals she once believed in so passionately. Remember, this was someone who once starved herself nearly to death for the cause. But now, she's grappling with the idea that it might all have been for nothing. Her confessions on the Boston tapes are both shocking and heartbreaking. She talks openly about her role in Jean McConville's abduction and murder, and she doesn't hold back. The guilt is eating her alive, but what's even more fascinating is the way she rationalizes her actions. She truly believed she was doing the right thing at the time, even as it tore her apart. At the same time, we see how Jerry Adams, the charismatic figure who became the face of Sinn Féin, navigates the aftermath of the Troubles. Adams is a master of reinvention. Throughout the book, there's this question hanging over him. Was he or wasn't he in the IRA? Adams denies it, of course, but the Boston tapes tell a different story. Dolores Price, for one, is adamant that Adams was deeply involved, even ordering the abduction of Jean McConville. What's incredible is how Adams manages to sidestep these accusations and recast himself as a peacemaker. He's the politician who helped broker the Good Friday Agreement, the leader who urged the IRA to lay down their arms. But Keefe doesn't let us forget the darker side of his legacy, the secrets, the denials, and the people left behind in his climb to power. One of the most powerful themes in this part of the book is the idea of memory, how we remember, and how we choose to forget. For the McConville children, memory is a source of both pain and resilience. They've spent their lives trying to piece together what happened to their mother, but every answer only seems to lead to more questions. Meanwhile, for the former IRA members who participated in the Boston tapes, memory is something to be feared. The things they did in the name of the cause are things they'd rather leave in the past. But as the tapes prove, the past has a way of catching up with you. Another unforgettable moment is when Keefe delves into the concept of justice. What does justice even look like in a conflict like the Troubles? For the McConville family, It's about accountability, finding out who was responsible for their mother's death and holding them to account. For the IRA, it's about loyalty, protecting their own, even if it means burying the truth. And for the British government, justice is just another tool in a game of political chess. The way these competing definitions collide is both infuriating and tragic. No one gets what they want. No one walks away unscathed. The final chapters of Part 3 are where everything comes full circle. The McConville family finally learns the truth about what happened to their mother. Her remains are found, decades later, on a beach in the Republic of Ireland. It's a moment of closure, but it's not the kind you'd hope for. There's no catharsis, no sense of justice served. It's just another reminder of the senselessness of it all. Jean McConville wasn't a spy. She wasn't a threat. She was a widow trying to survive in a world that had no room for her. Her death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a crime, one that no amount of political maneuvering or peace agreements can erase. As the book ends, you're left with this overwhelming sense of loss, not just for Jean McConville and her family, but for everyone who lived through the Troubles. The violence, the secrecy, the sacrifices, it all took a toll, and it's a toll that's still being felt today. And yet, there's also a sense of resilience. The McConville children survived. Northern Ireland has, in many ways, moved on. But as Keefe shows us, the scars of the past are still there, just beneath the surface. Part 3 is a reckoning in every sense of the word. It forces us to confront the harsh realities of war and its aftermath, the human cost, the moral compromises, and the stories that refuse to stay buried. It's the kind of storytelling that stays with you long after you've finished the book. And if there's one thing you take away from this section, it's this. Silence can be as powerful as any weapon, but it can also be just as destructive. As we wrap up this journey through Say Nothing, it's clear that this book is so much more than a history of the Troubles. It's a deeply human story about what happens when a society is fractured by violence, fear, and mistrust. Patrick Radden Keefe doesn't just chronicle the events, he makes us feel the weight of them. Through the lives of Jean McConville, the Price sisters, and countless others, we see how conflict doesn't just destroy buildings and bodies, it destroys trust, families, and even the memories people cling to. So, what's the overarching message of Say Nothing? It's that silence has a cost. Whether it's the silence of a community that won't speak out, the silence imposed by fear, or the silence of those in power trying to bury their past, that silence can echo for generations. The Troubles may have ended with the Good Friday Agreement, but the scars remain. And as Keefe shows us, those scars are just as much about the things left unsaid as the things that happened. This book is significant because it forces us to look at history not as a series of dates and events, but as a tapestry woven from individual lives and choices. It gives voice to the people who lived through the Troubles, who carried the weight of those years in their bodies and minds. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about how conflicts like this don't have clear heroes or villains, just people making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. And what are the key lessons we should take away? First, history is messy, and understanding it requires listening to every perspective, even the ones that make us uncomfortable. Second, peace is fragile. It's built not just on agreements, but on accountability and reckoning with the past. And finally, this story reminds us that the human cost of war isn't just measured in lives lost, but in the long shadows it casts over those who survive. Say Nothing isn't just a history book, it's a reminder of the resilience and fragility of humanity. It's a call to remember that the stories we tell, the silences we keep, and the truths we uncover all shape the world we leave behind. So, as you close this video, I encourage you to think about the power of memory, the weight of silence, and the importance of seeking justice even when it feels out of reach. If you found this story as compelling as I did, let me know your thoughts in the comments. What do you think is the true cost of silence? And how do we move forward while carrying the weight of history? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video because these are stories worth telling.